The recording has started.
Okay, here we go. So I'm going to speak today about specifically to the Sierra Wireless Airlink users regarding this 2019 GPS rollover issue. And I hope to answer these questions for you, you see on the screen. So what exactly is the issue? Will you be affected by this issue? And the answer is you may, even though you're not using or needing GPS. And what can you do to resolve this issue? First of all, what exactly is the issue? It's a global issue. This is not just exclusive to Sierra Wireless. It involves the global positioning system directly, and it stems from just one second here. So it stems from how it was originally designed back in the 1970s. As part of the date-time system architecture, they came up with a 10-bit counter that increments by 1 every week. And so instead of like a month or year, it's a week. And so with 10 bits, if you do the math, it will only has a maximum of 1,024 weeks that it can account for. So when this rolls over, it rolls over to 0 every 19.7 years. And so what this means is that for firmware and software that uses the date-time information from the GPS satellites, you're going to need to account for this rollover in some form or another. So unfortunately, Sierra Wireless Alios is one of those systems, several systems that are out there that only recently accounted for this rollover situation. So to understand, why this issue goes beyond just GPS locating or location reporting, so let's dig into system time on the Sierra Wireless Airlink devices. So it's important for the entire Airlink gateway itself to have an accurate time source. And so this is especially important for encrypted and certificate-based communications because they're time-stamped. And so Sierra Wireless derives its system time from one of possibly 3 different sources. And so the first priority of the source is the Simple Time Network Protocol feature, SNTP. And it's found under the Services tab, right here, Services tab in ACE Manager. And if this feature is enabled, you have a connectivity to a time server. You'll be fine after November 3rd, without any further action whatsoever. However, note the time server is a public address pulled at ntp.org. And that's great if you're on a public network. Now, if you're on a private network, you're going to need to pinhole to this URL or firewall or spin up your own internal time server. But if that's enabled, that's first priority, that the gateway gets system time from SMTP, and you're good to go. So if SNTP is not enabled, the second source for system time that Sierra gateways go to is the GPS system, or the location services. It was formerly called GPS. So if that's enabled, that's where it goes next for the system time. So if neither the first 2 sources are enabled, then Sierra Wireless goes to the wireless system, to the carrier, basically, if the carrier is connected, as you see here on the carrier state. When it's connected, it gets the system time through that network. So let's focus on number 2. Even if you are not using the GPS, and even if no antenna is connected, the determination of if you have this issue is solely dependent on the GPS or location services is enabled or if it's not enabled. We had seen on some occasions with the services enabled that with certain atmospheric conditions with no antenna, the GPS lock happens. If there's a couple of strong satellites, and if this happens, your system time will be off. No antenna, just if it happens to be enabled, and you're not even knowing it's enabled, you're not even using it, you could have this issue. So it's important to mitigate that. So now that we have an understanding of the issue, the next question is, will you be affected by this? So I'm going to start by answering, okay, what's not affected by this? So it's not affected on any of the models up top here, the RV50X, the RV55, the MP70, MG90, LX40, LX60, and the ES series. What is affected is the RV50, the GX450, the GX440, the 400, and the LS300. Also, what's not affected on any device is standard in-band communications to and from your devices. Whether it's on an internet or a private network, whether you're using PLCs, computers, that communication will not be affected. So what is affected? So it's going to be, first of all, errors in the GPS reporting. If we're using GPS, the reports are going to be off. They're going to show, they're going to jump back 20 years or possibly even 40 years because the GPS system started on 1980 and then it had its rollover already happened in 1999. Now we're having it again this year. And then you're also not going to have GPS lock on older CDMA devices, and we'll go over that in a little bit. So in general, any application that uses a transport layer security TLS digital certificate on a gateway is vulnerable to incorrect system time. Now, Sierra Wireless, uses the TLS on the following systems. Actually, oops, jumped ahead there. So ACE Manager HTTPS for remote access. Now, if you're using HTTP, you're fine. But if you have HTTPS as your remote access, and there's a setting in there saying HTTPS only, which is recommended from a security perspective. If you need remote access to have that only on, that's going to be affected. ALMS communications will be affected. They'll shut down on November 3rd if you have this issue. AirLink Manager and AirLink Mobility Manager, AMM. And in any gateway hosted certificate-based applications. And so those applications are the following. Certain VPN tunnel methods, event-based email communications, LDAP authentication if you're using your certificate, same thing with remote logging and certain Wi-Fi WAN situations. Basically, anything in ACE Manager where you see this red button where you load a client certificate, those are also applications that would be affected. They're not going to work after this because they rely on a date time stamp to validate their certificate. And if it jumps back 20 years, it says this certificate is not valid. We're not in the time zone, so to speak, of the validation of that certificate. So how is this resolved? Well, let's jump right to the easiest way. If you're not using GPS, make sure it's disabled. Either disable it or make sure it's disabled. Found on the location tab. They used to call it GPS, but in recent firmwares, they changed the name to location services because you may know, it's beyond GPS is GNSS and other satellite systems as well. So they just changed the name to location. So location service, disable. Make sure it's disabled. That's the easiest fix for this thing if you're not using GPS. And so, again, even if you don't have an antenna connected, it could still happen. Let me tell you a little story. So our Sierra Wireless regional rep had called me and said, hey, look, I did not believe that you could get a GPS lock with an antenna, but my office is in the attic. And sure enough, I disconnected my GPS antenna and I got 6 satellites. I could not believe it. 6 satellites were locked on. So there's an example, especially if your device is out in the field, no GPS antenna, you could still have this issue if location services is enabled. And don't just assume that because you never did anything with it or never configured it, it's disabled. In fact, some devices, the default was enabled out of the box. And so unless you purposely went and disabled that, that could be an issue for you. So it's best just to go in and make sure you're disabled in that scenario. So the next thing you can do to resolve, and of course this is the best way, is to upgrade your firmware. Now understand, and best practice is you upgrade the firmware on one unit, you test it, make sure nothing else breaks before you upgrade all of it. So we're not saying go immediately go out and upgrade your firmware without doing some system testing. But the latest firmware on these devices do fix the issue and you'll be perfectly fine with that. That's the best way. But again, test your systems first with this firmware before you mass deploy it to your systems. So Sierra Wireless is also reporting that GPS lock on CDMA networks may not even be achievable past November 3rd. So this would be Verizon and Sprint on older devices like the LS300, GX440, etc. The best thing to do is if there are LTE devices that you can disable 3G fallback, do that, because then if you're using the GPS, it's not going to have the issue. All right. So now, if you're, of course, another way you can resolve this is if you don't have, you're not making use of the feature, the time server feature, which is the why Sierra Wireless has this up in the priority is it is the most accurate time source out there. So just go simply in and enable that under the services tab, and it'll be fine. Now, if you're still using GPS for reporting, you're still going to have reporting errors. It's still going to show on your GPS system, if you're using the reporting feature of GPS location services, that's still going to show errors. But at least all your communications, your management communications, your certificate communications, they're going to be fine as long as we're using this SMTP service. Okay. So here's some devices. This came from Sierra. What they're saying is the devices that are affected and what to do with it. So, and the LS300 basically upgrade the device. You all know that 3G is going away on CDMA networks, and so if it's an issue, you're using those, just upgrade those. Many of our clients have already done that. If you have some out there, now's the time to take care of this. And so, non-CDMA, for instance, AT&T and other carriers, upgrade to alias 448 on the LS300. GX440, same thing. Upgrade the device. They're CDMA, or you're going to have the issue where GPS doesn't lock. So the GPS function will be a problem for you. And these other ones are upgrading the firmware. And then in the case of, let's see, the GX440, disable fallback, so you don't have that issue coming into play. All right, so that's pretty much it. I'm gonna, if just a second here, I'm gonna unmute the lines.
All participants are muted and they can unmute themselves.
All right, so I'm unmuting the lines for you. And if there's any questions, just give me another second here. Get everybody unmuted that I see that's on here. Okay, everybody is unmuted on the phone line. Let me unmute on the 3CX if you're only joining the audio that way. Okay, so who has the first question that we can talk about?
Hey Keith, this is Hank Jones. One of your slides regarding SMTP mentioned public networks or SMTPs over private network. I'm going to assume that all those settings are going to be the same as far as that goes.
Yeah, so if you're on a private network, you just have to have access to one-time server. So the pool.ntp.org is a server pool of servers. And so you basically, if you enable ntp.org on your firewall to get out to on a private network, then you should be good to access all the pool servers. Short of that, Google has one, time.google.com, I think they just recently spun up in the last couple of years. Or if you have your own internal time server to your network, then all devices will have access to it. You can do that way as well.
Okay, very good.
Who else?
Yes, as far as these settings, I know the recommended option, of course, is to reboot the modem once changing any settings. Can you verify
Yes.
that the SMTP will update without a reboot?
Yeah, that's a tough one to call. So, for instance, so I'm logging into a device right now. So you're saying going into SMTP, clicking enable, and applying. Okay, please reboot device when all changes are complete. And okay, what I've kind of found with Sierra is they don't guarantee that any of their settings, some of the settings actually will take effect without a reboot. But they will always tell you across the board, anytime that you're doing a setting, you'll see that little pop-up that we saw there. Yeah, they're saying, oh, it's best to reboot. Some of them change immediately and some of them do not. And actually what I've also found is some of them that used to require a reboot, a later firmware, they take effect right away. So they don't publish any of that information. You just kind of, to be safe, say you're going to need to do a reboot.
Okay, but you can't verify that the SMTP might be one of those settings that doesn't need a reboot.
Yeah, I mean, I have to think of how I could even possibly verify that, because I'd actually have to, well, I could disable location services and not use a carrier and actually see whether I get time. I could actually possibly run that test, but I don't know that it'd be 100% guaranteed. I think to be on the safe side, we would recommend a reboot. Is there a specific situation that you're running into where you might need to not reboot?
A bunch of these modems at sites that are up 24/7, and coordinating outages can be a challenge. And if there's a way to enable SMTP without rebooting, that would be the best option. I know turning off the GPS radio is going to require a reboot.
Yeah.
If we need to do that, but if there's a way to reduce any kind of downtime,
sure,
that would be preferable.
Sure. Yeah, that's that one I do not know at this point. I have to figure out a way that I can actually test that. If you is your rep Dan Drinkwalder?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Let me test that, and I'll get back with Dan, and then and see whether I can have some definitive results on that, and then he can contact you.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, just make sure I got your name. What'd you say your name was again? Hank Jones. Okay. All right, Hank. Yeah. Let me see if I can do that test, and then get back to you to see whether that's going to require a reboot or not for the SMTP time.
Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Hey, Keith,
Hello.
can you restate the mitigation for people that just joined?
Oh, absolutely. So let's go to the slides that had that. So basically, if you're not using, hang on, let me get to the right slide here. If you're not using GPS, disable GPS, or now called location services. That's the first way. The second way is upgrade the firmware. Now, I understand that upgrading the firmware requires, for most organizations, and it should, large organizations with complex applications, to test it on one or two units first before you upgrade the entire fleet of modems or devices. And then third would be to enable SMTP, public networks only, unless you want to spin up your private network. And lastly, on the LS300s, on CDMA devices and the GX440s, upgrade to a newer device. I highly recommend the RV55. It is excellent. I just got this not too long ago. Started doing a lot of testing on it, and it is tremendous. So again, for LS300s, GX400s, time to upgrade. All right, any other questions that I can help anybody with? If you come up with any later on, by all means, please contact your account representative. He can get me she can get you in touch with me, or there's a phone number and email address that you can get me directly as well. I'll be happy to answer any additional questions that you all may have in the future or come up with, and hopefully your systems are not going to be adversely affected by this situation. But if so, hopefully we could give you a clear path to mitigate the situation. All right, last call for questions. Okay, hearing none, I'm going to shut down the webinar. Thanks everyone for joining, and have a great afternoon.